The billionaire's lonely son cried silently until the waitress told him, "A child needs love, not money." The broken beginning. The crystal chandelier above table 12 cast dancing shadows across Oliver Sterling's untouched plate of lobster risotto. His small fingers clutched a crumpled photograph beneath the white linen tablecloth, while silent tears carved paths down his flushed cheeks. Around him, Manhattan's elite clinked champagne glasses and discussed stock portfolios, completely unaware of the 8-year-old's crumbling world. Richard Sterling sat across from his son, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the holographic projection emanating from his watch. The merger documents required his signature by midnight, and 3 board members waited expectantly for his response. At 41, Richard had built Sterling Innovations from a college dorm project into a tech empire valued at $12 billion. But tonight, on what would have been his late wife's 42nd birthday, even his legendary focus wavered. "Oliver, please," Richard murmured without looking up, his voice barely audible over the restaurant's ambient jazz. "We've discussed this. Madison wouldn't want you making a scene." But Oliver couldn't stop. The photograph in his hand showed his mother laughing on a beach in Santorini, her auburn hair wild in the Mediterranean wind. That trip had been 3 years ago, just months before the cancer diagnosis that would take her away forever. Tonight marked exactly 3 years since her death, and Richard had forgotten entirely, scheduling this business dinner as if it were just another Thursday evening. Natalie Brooks had been watching the scene unfold from her station near the kitchen entrance. In her 5 years working at the Azure Crown, she'd served countless powerful families, but something about the trembling child broke through her professional detachment. Perhaps it was because her own daughter, Sophie, sometimes wore that same expression of desperate loneliness when Natalie's double shifts kept her away too long. She approached the table with practiced grace, her notepad tucked discreetly under her arm. "Excuse me, gentlemen," she said softly, addressing the board members who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Might I suggest our private dining room for your meeting? It offers more privacy for business discussions." Richard finally looked up, irritation flickering across his chiseled features. "We're fine here." "I wasn't asking for your benefit, Mr. Sterling," Natalie replied, her tone respectful but firm. Her gaze shifted to Oliver. "I was thinking of your son." Something in her directness caught Richard off guard. Most people either fawned over him or avoided confrontation entirely. This waitress did neither. "The private room," he found himself saying to his board members. "Give us 10 minutes." As the men gathered their tablets and documents, Natalie knelt beside Oliver's chair, bringing herself to his eye level. "Hey there," she whispered. "I'm Natalie. What's your name?" "Oliver," he managed through his tears, his voice small and broken. "That's a strong name," she said gently. "You know what I do when I'm feeling sad, Oliver. I think about 3 things that make me happy. Want to try?" Oliver hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Okay, I'll go first," Natalie said, settling more comfortably beside his chair. 1. My daughter Sophie, who's 5 and believes she can talk to butterflies. 2. Chocolate chip pancakes on Sunday mornings. 3. That feeling when you finish a really good book." She smiled warmly. "Now you try." Oliver's breathing began to slow as he considered the question. "My dog, Winston," he whispered. "He's a golden retriever." "Excellent choice. What else?" "Building things with code. I made a game last week where you help lost robots find their way home." "That's amazing," Natalie said, genuinely impressed. "One more?" Oliver's face clouded again. "I can't think of anything else." Natalie glanced at Richard, who was watching their interaction with an unreadable expression. "How about this?" she said to Oliver. "How about we add making new friends to the list? Because I think you and my daughter would get along great. She loves robots." For the first time that evening, a tiny smile touched Oliver's lips. "Really?" "Really," Natalie confirmed. She stood up, addressing Richard directly. "Mr. Sterling, I hope you don't mind my overstepping, but your son seems like he could use some company his own age, and maybe some time away from business meetings." Richard's eager jaw tightened. Most people wouldn't dare criticize his parenting, especially not a restaurant employee. But as he looked at Oliver's tear-stained face, something inside him cracked. "You're right," he said quietly. "Thank you for noticing what I should have seen." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and raw. "I should get back to work," Natalie said, preparing to leave. "Wait," Richard said, pulling out his phone. "I'd like your contact information. I have a proposition for you." Natalie raised an eyebrow. "If you're about to offer me money to forget this conversation—" "No," Richard interrupted. "I'm about to offer you a job. Oliver needs someone like you in his life. Someone who sees him, really sees him. I'm prepared to compensate you generously to be his companion, tutor, whatever title makes you comfortable." Natalie stared at him, stunned. "You want to hire me to be your son's friend?" "I want to hire you to give him what I apparently can't," Richard replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Attention, care, the ability to prioritize him over spreadsheets and stock prices." "That's not something you hire someone for, Mr. Sterling," Natalie said softly. "That's something you learn to do yourself." Richard flinched at the truth in her words. "You're right, but I'm asking for help. I'm asking you to teach me how to be present for my son while also being there for him yourself. Name your price." Natalie thought of her mounting student loans, Sophie's upcoming dental expenses, and their cramped one-bedroom apartment in Queens. The offer was tempting, dangerously so, but something felt wrong about commodifying care. "I have conditions," she said finally. 1. You commit to being home for dinner with Oliver at least 4 nights a week, no exceptions. 2. You attend his school events, all of them. 3. Every Sunday is family day, no work allowed. And 4. This isn't about replacing you as his father. It's about supplementing what he needs while you figure out how to show up properly. Richard nodded slowly. "Agreed. What about compensation?" "We'll discuss that later," Natalie said. "First, I need to know this is about Oliver, not about salving your guilt or checking a box on your to-do list. It's about saving my son," Richard replied, his voice breaking slightly. "Before I lose him completely." Oliver had been listening to the entire exchange, his eyes wide. "Dad?" he said tentatively. "Do you really mean it? About dinners and school stuff?" Richard moved from his chair to kneel beside his son, something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. "I mean it, Oliver. I've been a terrible father since your mother died. I threw myself into work because I didn't know how to handle the grief. But that was wrong, and I'm sorry." Oliver threw his arms around Richard's neck, his small body shaking with fresh tears, but different ones now. Tears of relief, of hope, of a child who'd been lost finally being found. Natalie watched them, her own eyes misting. "I'll need to think about the specifics," she said. "But yes, Mr. Sterling, I'll help you, for Oliver's sake." As she walked back to the kitchen, Natalie pulled out her phone and texted her best friend, Carmen. "You won't believe what just happened. Call you after my shift." Behind her, Richard held his son close, the merger documents forgotten on the table. For the first time in 3 years, something mattered more than business, and it terrified him how long it had taken to realize that. The Azure Crown's maitre d' approached the table discreetly. "Sir, your board members are waiting in the private room." Richard looked at Oliver, then at his watch, then back at his son. "Tell them the meeting's canceled," he said. Tell them I have more important matters to attend to tonight." Oliver's eyes widened in disbelief. "Really? We can go home?" "We can do whatever you want," Richard replied, meaning it completely. "Maybe we could take Winston to the park. I know it's late, but—" "Yes," Oliver exclaimed, his face transformed by genuine joy. "Can Natalie and Sophie come too?" Richard glanced toward the kitchen, where Natalie had disappeared. "Let's ask her when she's done with work." "But Oliver, even if they can't tonight, this is our new normal, I promise." As father and son waited for Natalie to finish her shift, Oliver showed Richard the coding project on his tablet, explaining the logic behind each decision. Richard listened, truly listened, and realized with shame how much he'd missed in his son's life. The boy was brilliant, creative, and desperately lonely. all things Richard had been too blind to see. When Natalie emerged from the kitchen an hour later, still in her uniform, she found them huddled over the tablet, Richard's arm around Oliver's shoulders. The sight made her pause. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. The healing journey. 3 weeks later, Natalie sat in the sun-drenched kitchen of the Sterling penthouse, watching Sophie and Oliver build an elaborate robot city out of recyclable materials. The children's laughter echoed through the formerly silent apartment, bringing life to spaces that had felt like a museum since Madison's death. "The recycling robots need a mayor," Sophie announced, her curly black hair bouncing as she placed a cardboard figure at the center of their creation. "Someone who makes good decisions." "Mayor Winston," Oliver declared, holding up a toy that vaguely resembled his golden retriever. "He'll make sure all the robots get enough battery power and friendship." Natalie smiled, making notes on her tablet. She'd transitioned from Waitress to Oliver's full-time companion and tutor, a change that had shocked everyone in her life except Carmen, who'd simply said, "You were born to help people, Nat. This is just you doing what you do best." The arrangement was unconventional, certainly. Natalie and Sophie now lived in the penthouse's guest wing, a 4-room suite that was larger than their entire Queens apartment. Richard had insisted on enrolling Sophie in the same elite private school as Oliver, covering all expenses. In return, Natalie spent her days ensuring Oliver felt seen, heard, and loved. But the real miracle was Richard himself. True to his word, he'd restructured his entire schedule. Board meetings now ended by 5 o'clock sharp. He attended Oliver's robotics club every Tuesday and Friday. Sundays were sacred, devoted to family outings that ranged from museum visits to simply flying kites in Central Park. The transformation hadn't been smooth. Richard struggled with the concept of being present without solving problems or optimizing experiences. Natalie had caught him trying to hire a consultant to make their park visits more efficient, until she'd gently reminded him that the point was unstructured time together. "How do you do it?" Richard had asked her one evening after the children were asleep. They'd fallen into a routine of sharing tea in the kitchen, debriefing about the day. "How do you make it look so effortless, connecting with them?" "It's not effortless," Natalie admitted, "but I learned early that children don't need perfect. They need present. Sophie taught me that when she was 2 and I was working 3 jobs. I'd come home exhausted, barely able to stand, and she'd just want to show me a rock she found. At first I tried to rush through it. Then I realized those rocks were her way of saying, 'I missed you. I want your attention. I matter to you.'" Richard absorbed this, his expression thoughtful. "I keep waiting for Oliver to need something I can fix, a problem I can throw money or resources at. But he just wants you," Natalie finished. "Just you, showing up consistently." The weeks turned into months. Media attention, which had initially been invasive, gradually faded as more sensational stories captured the public's interest. Richard's ex-girlfriend Christine had tried to stir up drama, but her attempts fell flat when Richard publicly introduced Natalie as Oliver's companion and tutor, emphasizing the professional nature of their relationship. What he didn't mention, what he could barely admit to himself, was how Natalie's presence had begun to mean more than just support for Oliver. He found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, appreciating her insights not just about his son, but about life itself. She challenged him in ways no one else dared, calling out his workaholic tendencies while also acknowledging his genuine efforts to change. The real test came 4 months into their arrangement when Richard's company faced a crisis. A major security breach threatened to derail their largest product launch. The old Richard would have disappeared into his office for 72 hours straight, subsisting on coffee and stress. Instead, he called an emergency board meeting at 6 in the morning, delegated ruthlessly, and was home by dinner time. "How bad is it?" Natalie asked that evening, noting the tension in his shoulders. "Bad," Richard admitted. "We might lose $100 million, maybe more." Oliver, who'd been doing homework nearby, looked up with concern. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" Richard crossed the room and pulled his son into a hug. "We're going to be fine, buddy. The company might take a hit, but we'll survive. More importantly, I'll be here with you through it." Not locked in my office pretending I can control everything. The statement represented a shift so profound that Natalie felt tears prick her eyes. This was the growth she'd hoped for, but hadn't quite believed possible. The crisis eventually resolved with less damage than predicted, partly because Richard's visible confidence and delegation had impressed the board and investors. But the real victory was personal. Richard had proven to himself and Oliver that work emergencies didn't have to consume his entire existence. As summer approached, marking 6 months since their arrangement began, Natalie began to feel a shift in their dynamic. What had started as a professional relationship had evolved into something resembling a family. Sophie called Richard Uncle Richard, and Winston the Golden Retriever had become as much her dog as Oliver's. But Natalie also noticed something else. The way Richard's eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the accidental touches that lasted a moment too long, the way his whole face softened when she entered a room. She felt it too, this pull toward him. But the complications terrified her. What happened if they crossed that line and it didn't work out? Oliver would lose another important person, and she'd lose not just a job, but a home and security for Sophie. The decision was taken out of their hands on a Tuesday evening in June. Richard had taken both children to their robotics exhibition at school, giving Natalie a rare evening alone. She'd used it to catch up with Carmen over video call, discussing her growing feelings for her employer. "So you're in love with him," Carmen said bluntly. "Have you told him?" "I can't," Natalie replied. "It's too risky. Oliver's well-being has to come first." "And what about your well-being?" Carmen challenged. "What about Oliver's well-being when you're denying yourself happiness? Kids pick up on that stuff, Nat." The conversation was interrupted by the front door opening. Richard entered alone, his expression troubled. "Where are the kids?" Natalie asked. "Immediately." "With Mrs. Patterson in the game room," Richard replied, referring to the housekeeper. "I asked her to watch them for a few minutes. We need to talk." Natalie's heart sank. This sounded like termination. "I've been thinking about our arrangement," Richard began, pacing across the kitchen. "About how it's evolved over these past 6 months. If this is about boundaries, I can be more professional," Natalie said quickly. "I know sometimes I overstep." "No," Richard interrupted, stopping in front of her. "This is about how our arrangement isn't working anymore." Natalie's breath caught. "It's not working," Richard continued, "because it's built on a fiction. The fiction that you're just an employee, that this is just a job, that we're not." He ran his hand through his hair, frustrated. "I'm saying this badly." "Richard," Natalie whispered. "I'm in love with you," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I've been in love with you probably since that first night at the restaurant when you saw my son when I couldn't. And I know this is complicated and inappropriate and probably violates some employment law, but I can't keep pretending that what I feel is professional respect when it's so much more." Natalie stood frozen, her heart racing. "The kids," she managed. "We have to think about Oliver and Sophie." "I am thinking about them," Richard replied. "Oliver asked me last week if you were going to stay forever, and when I said I didn't know, he cried. Not because he was sad in that moment, but because he couldn't imagine you not being here. Neither can I. This could ruin everything," Natalie said, even as she took a step toward him. "If it doesn't work out, then we'll handle it like adults, putting the children first," Richard said. "But Natalie, what if it does work out? What if we could be a real family, not just people living in the same space playing pretend?" Natalie thought of all the evening conversations, the shared laughter, the way they'd built something precious over these months. She thought of Oliver's transformation from a lonely, crying child to a confident boy full of joy. She thought of Sophie thriving in ways she never could have in their old life. And she thought of her own heart, which had been guarded for so long after Sophie's father left, now opening to this complicated, brilliant, broken man who'd learned to heal. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been terrified to admit it." Richard closed the distance between them, cupping her face gently. "May I kiss you?" Instead of answering, Natalie rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, and perfect. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "So, Richard said, his forehead resting against hers. I guess we need to tell the kids we're upgrading our arrangement. Upgrading? Natalie laughed. Is that what we're calling it? What would you call it? I'd call it finally admitting what's been true for a while now, Natalie replied. That we're a family, messy and unconventional, but real. That night they gathered Oliver and Sophie in the living room. The children sat on the couch, looking between the adults with curious expressions. We have something to tell you, Richard began, then looked at Natalie helplessly. Your dad and I have feelings for each other, Natalie said gently. The romantic kind, and we wanted to check how you both feel about that. Oliver's face split into a huge grin. Does this mean Natalie's staying forever? If that's okay with you? Richard replied. And Sophie's really my sister now? Oliver asked. If you want to be, Sophie said shyly. Oliver jumped off the couch and hugged Sophie. This is the best day ever. The simplicity of children's acceptance made both adults laugh with relief. Later, after tucking the excited children into bed, Richard and Natalie stood on the penthouse balcony overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline. 6 months ago, Richard said, I was a man who'd forgotten how to live, raising a son who'd forgotten how to smile. You changed all of that. We changed it together, Natalie corrected. You did the hard work, Richard. You chose to show up, to change, to prioritize what matters. I just helped you remember how. A child needs love, not money, Richard quoted softly, remembering her words from that first night. You were right. And you learned the lesson, Natalie replied, leaning into his embrace. That's what matters. As they stood together under the stars, two broken families pieced together into something whole. They both understood that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, adjustments to make, and new lessons to learn. But they would face them together, with love as their foundation instead of contracts or convenience. Inside, Winston the golden retriever lay sprawled across both children's beds, where Oliver and Sophie had insisted on having a sleepover to celebrate their new family status. They dreamed of robot cities and butterfly conversations, safe in the knowledge that they were loved, seen, and cherished. And in the morning, Richard would make his famous chocolate chip pancakes, while Natalie would tell silly stories, and their unconventional, beautiful family would begin another day of simply being present for each other. Because in the end, that's what mattered most, not the penthouse or the wealth or the perfect circumstances, but the willingness to show up, to care, and to love without reservation.